and I want to leave time for Mr. Hawley to also ask some questions before he has to take off, because I know he's busy. So I'll be as brief as I can, but I've got a lot of questions, as you know. I'm for codifying. I'm for standardization. I'm for more certainty and predictability going forward. I think it's a good idea. FedRAMP in practice, I think, is a good idea. It's essential. And yet the security issue just bothers me. And I want to be sure we fully vet this. Foreign interference in particular is a deep concern of mine, and I think it is of others as well. Second, I want to talk about potential conflicts of interest with the assessment process. I don't know why we have the companies that are getting assessed, choose their assessor and then pay for the assessor. It seems to me that creates at least an appearance of a conflict. And then third is just the cost and timing issue. And you've addressed that. Maybe things are getting better, but we need to allow the service providers to be able to have a sense of how much time it's going to take, and like any regulatory process, how much it's going to cost to make sure that we're getting the very best cloud services. And that's the whole idea here, right? Is the federal government, has the gold standard. On the first issue, which is the foreign interference, this committee has been very active on this issue. Safeguarding American Innovation Act came out of this committee. Senator Hawley's been really taking the lead in this Congress to protect the government from data from China through legislation that would ban TikTok as an example on government devices. Other senators have similarly been very involved on both sides of the aisle. So I know we care about it a lot, and this committee tends to be a place where a lot of that happens. My concern is that the source of some of this code that we're relying on in the federal government may well be from foreign entities, and specifically engineers in China. And I just want to make sure I understand why we would want to permit that. And then the second issue that I've identified is that we don't have to keep up with the disclosures. So you make an initial disclosure saying I'm owned by, this company from the UK, this company from the United States, or whatever. But then as an example, not to just focus on China, but if China becomes an owner, there's no requirement to update that disclosure, as I understand it. And to me, that seems like an obvious problem that ought to be addressed in this legislation. If we're going to codify this thing, let's be sure that we're not putting ourselves in that position. So, Mr. Stern, turning to you, you're the one that's not here, so you're easy to turn to. Can you talk a little about that? Your observations on supply chain risk and foreign interference as it relates to FedRAMP.
Sure. Thank you, Senator Portman. I'm going to talk about three things. The first is the system security plan and the fact that FedRAMP authorization of the SSP does not seem to look or assess the provenance of the software and the service offering. As you mentioned, the code could all be developed in China, yet there's no disclosure requirement here. Our recommendation around that has been that at least you may not be able to stop this because of the global supply chain, but at the very least, a buyer or user at DoD or at DHS or wherever should be able to know how much of the code was written overseas and what percentage was written overseas. And we've offered up some metrics as recommendations in the past about how to sort of what I'll call do truth in advertising or truth in disclosure, not only in the authorization process, but also for the purchaser who's going to use the service. The second is that the system boundary, our observation, system security boundary for authorization seems to be defined too narrowly. We've seen cases where, for example, even though your customer care people are here in the United States, no one is looking at the customer care system itself and who's maintaining it and what engineers overseas, particularly in a country like China, can have access to the entire customer care information, including the PII, the personal identifiable information of U.S. government users, their IP addresses, their email addresses, their names, phone numbers, etc. And then the third is we observed a case where one of the three PAO organizations had already been through a CFIUS process where CFIUS and DCSA, Defense Counterintelligence Security Agency, as a result of a foreign acquisition of the company, required establishment of a mitigated subsidiary to hold a security clearance, yet it was not the mitigated sub who continued to be the 3PAO. It was the foreign unmitigated parent of the mitigated sub who continued as the PAO. And so we believe that 3 PAOs, there's a thing called an SF-328. It's a form which declares how much foreign ownership you have. We believe every 3 PAO needs to be, it has to fill out a SF-328, both a change of ownership, but annually, new 328s, which are easy to fill out, should be filed by every 3 PAO.
Great. Well, thank you. And by the way, it was the PAOs that I was referring to in terms of that ownership requirement, having to update it. And it seems to me that's a relatively easy fix. Maybe the first one's a little bit harder. We have recommended some language that just gives the GSA the authority and the requirement really to review, quote, the sufficiency of underlying standards and requirements to identify and assess the provenance of the software in cloud services and products in the FedRAMP program, end quote. So that would allow GSA to assist NIST in developing and improving the standards regarding foreign interference. Do others, Ms. Mahan in particular, do you have concerns with that kind of language? Do you think that, does that not go far enough, or does it go too far? What do you think about stopping this this concern we have about foreign interference?
Thank you, Senator. I just wanted to thank Chain Security and Mr. Stern, as we met, as he alluded to in 2020, where he provided some of these recommendations. And we had a good conversation discussing, the recommendations he brought up today, as well as we took the due diligence and steps to research those out. There were some things that we were working on already in progress, and things that we implemented based on his recommendations and research. I do think that this is a area that is continuing to evolve daily. And as from a program standpoint, we are committed to evolve with it. In terms of geolocation for the government's most sensitive, unclassified data, we call that part of our high workloads. There are geolocation restrictions to U.S. and territories with U.S. jurisdiction, as well as we're continuing to work with NIST and with future updates to provide additional security controls when it does come to supply chain. But again, we are absolutely committed to be working with the committee, as well as different government agencies and industry to ensure that the program continues to evolve as these threats are continuing to evolve as well.
Okay. I want to let my colleague, Mr. Hawley, jump in here, but let me just say, and we'll get back into the potential conflict of interest issue I have, and also the cost and timing and the compliance burdens. But with regard to this issue, from what you're saying, it sounds like you agree with Mr. Stern generally, and you agree with a solution that gives you all, not just the authority, but the requirement to do that important compliance to make sure that we're not seeing foreign interference.
Absolutely. This is a critical area, a focus area, and we're committed to evolve in working with our industry and agency partners on this.
Okay.
And but just before Senator